Greetings to all my fellow ampliophiles out there in YouTube land, and welcome to today's video, in which we will discuss all the mysteries and unknown characteristics of the tube reverb effect. Although I did post a video on another channel before I had my own on this topic, I have never posted one on this channel before, so I think it's long overdue that we remedy that deficiency. And to assist in this discussion, I'm going to use a clone of the venerable Fender 6G15 standalone reverb tank. I built this years ago. In fact, this was probably my second home-built project. And what we're going to do then is use it kind of as our example of how reverb works. I have developed a schematic for a modified circuit that I used in this particular 6G15. I'm going to post that schematic in the video description for you, and hopefully this video series will stimulate a bunch of you to build your own 6G15 clones. Okay, so without further ado, let's get started. Rumor has it that Jack is hiding somewhere here in the house, and I've looked everywhere, but I just can't find him. Here is a preliminary schematic for the modified circuit. Tommy Foley has agreed to help me on this project, and so I'm going to rely on him to provide us with the best possible schematics, wiring diagrams, chassis diagrams, everything you'll need to construct your own Model 6G15 Fender reverb unit. I think you'll agree that a logical first step would be to understand how the circuit works. So I'm going to boil this schematic down into 3 parts, and over the next video or 2 videos we're going to discuss how each of those parts work and how they work together to produce the reverb effect. Part 1 will be what amounts to a Fender Champ amplifier. We have a power supply down here. Now, instead of a tube rectifier, we're going to use a full wave bridge rectifier. We're going to have a 12AT7, which is a little different than a 12AX7. We'll discuss that, as our preamp tubes, and they are going to drive either a 6K6 or 6V6 output tube. So this is part 1. What amounts to a 3-tube, or you could say 3-element amplifier. Now, instead of the output transformer here driving a speaker, and we could hook a speaker up right here, and this would be just a dandy amp. But instead, we're going to drive a reverb tank. And I'm going to go into some detail about how reverb tanks function, and I think will make clear to you exactly the purpose that they serve in this schematic, in this circuit. Now, think of the reverb tank really as a miniature auditorium for now. So we have a 3-element tube amp that is, instead of playing through a speaker, is going to directly drive what amounts to as a mini auditorium. And the final stage will be out here where we have a final stage of amplification for our reverb signal and a final stage of amplification for a clean or dry signal, as it is often called. If you look right here, we have a Y in the road. Half of our signal will go in here into the reverb, and the other half of the signal will come down here and go directly to one output triode. In this case, it says 70-25, but 12AX7s work just fine. So we're going to split a 12AX7. One triode is for our reverb signal. One triode is going to be for our dry or unreverbed signal. And then we're going to mix them together out here and send them into our amplifier so that whatever amp we have, whether it has reverb or not, will have a reverb input signal. So now let's get started on part 1, and that's going to be the 3-element amplifier that we use to drive the auditorium tank. You'll see the virtual center tap that we're going to construct around our 6.3 volt filament. This is very similar in effect to the hum reducing ability of a grounded center tap of the winding. This particular transformer does not offer us a center tapped 6.3 volt output. So we're going to send our 6.3 volt output through tightly twisted wires, as we do with all AC that is running around in the chassis, to all three of our tube filaments. Next, we will send our high voltage to our full wave bridge rectifier and use a filter choke, which I used model 22699 from Classic Tone. And I'm also going to change some of the values. Please don't try to use this as your final schematic. The final one is on the way, but we will filter before and after the filter choke. And then we will send the high voltage up here for one final filtration before we feed the plates of our tubes. Why, you ask, do we use so much filtration? Well, think about this. We're going to produce a signal here that's going into the first preamp stage of an amplifier. Any hum or noise that exists in this signal is going to be amplified hundreds of times over in the amplifier that's plugged in here to the output. And as a result, we have to keep this absolutely as quiet as possible. Okay, let's look then at our guitar input. We're going into a 12AT7 instead of a 12AX7 for reasons I will explain in just a minute. The 12AT7 has two triodes. It's virtually the same as a 12AX7 in that regard. You see that we have it is cathode biased here with a cathode bypass capacitor. We will output from that plate and come over here through a dwell control, which will then feed into the grid of the second stage. This should look just like the volume control in like a champ or any other 3-element amplifier, and it is. This is simply a volume control, but when we use it in a reverberation device, it's called dwell. Exactly why it's called that will become more clear when we discuss the characteristics of the reverb tank. But for now, let's just say that the stronger the signal, the louder the signal that we put out, in other words, the higher the volume or dwell of the signal that we put out here, the harder the auditorium reverb tank will be driven, and therefore the longer the reverb effect will persist. We'll see exactly what the time intervals are that the reverb effect can persist, but think of this as like an echo. And this tells how long the echo lasts and how much delay there is in the echo. Now we'll leave the plate of the second triode of the 12AT7 and feed right in here to the grid of either a 6K6 or a 6V6 tube, which is also cathode biased and capacitor bypassed. All of this should be pretty standard to you all. Doesn't it look exactly like every little 3-element amp you've ever seen? Not only that, look over here, we're going to drive an output transformer. And that's going to be the Classic Tone 47605 output transformer. If I hooked a speaker up right here to the secondary, this would be a fully functional 3-element amplifier with a volume control that you could use just like a Fender champ. But instead of a speaker, we're going to connect into a reverb tank. I think now we've covered everything here in our first stage of the reverb effect. Let's discuss the 12AT7 tube and see why it's probably a better choice than a 12AX7 in this regard. And to facilitate that, I've made a little graph here which breaks down the differences between the 12AX7 and the 12AT7. Amplification factor, nothing really can beat a 12AX7. But the AT7's no slouch with 60 compared to 100 amplification factor. Now let's start to see some differences where the 12AT7 is going to shine. Look at the plate current. What is that, like 8 times the 12AX7? And as we're going to see, current is what we want here because it's kind of difficult to drive a reverb tank. So we want initially all the current that we can muster to sort of slam into this tank and get the type of echo reaction that we want from it. Look here at plate dissipation. Obviously the AT7 is a much hardier tube than the AX7. And plate resistance, there's a huge difference between the two. And this lower plate resistance favors the 12AT7 in our purpose. Now before we leave this first stage of our reverb circuit, let's discuss the function of the output transformer here. Just a quick review so that we can understand the type of signal that we're sending here to the reverb tank. Now what I'm going to say here relates to all transformers, not just output transformers. Here we see we have an iron core transformer with a primary winding and a secondary winding. The one thing that's true about all transformers is the power in is equal to the power out. Now that's at 100% efficiency. In other words, if no heat is lost from the iron core here, but some is, we know that. You feel the transformer, it's warm, we're losing some power. So most of these operate at, say, around 80 or 90% efficiency. So what I'm going to say here is in an ideal situation, which doesn't exist in real life, but that doesn't matter because what I say then will help you to understand how it works, regardless of the efficiency of the transformer. Now, since this is true, the power on this side is equal to the power on that side, and according to Ohm's law, power is equal to voltage times current. And as we saw from our schematic, the voltage on the primary side is 225 volts AC. This is our signal strength based on the plate voltage of the 6K6 or 6V6. And let's say we're operating at about 40 milliamps, which should be about right for an output tube. That means that the power on our primary side is 225 times 0.04, about 9 watts. Let's look over here at the secondary side. Because our winding ratio in this particular type of reverb drive output transformer has a little higher winding ratio than most output transformers, let's estimate that it is 100 to 1. Therefore, the 225 volts in will yield 2.25 volts out. So we see here that we have 9 watts in our primary. On our secondary, our power is going to be 2.25 times what will have to equal the same 9 watts that we had in the primary. So in our secondary, the only number that works is 4. So we have a high voltage, low amp input and a low voltage, high amperage output. And this is true of all step-down transformers. Now, why do we do this? Well, I'm going to make a really strange analogy here, but I consider voltage to be like a threat. Voltage is not moving. Voltage is static. And it's like somebody on the other side of the fence yelling profanity at you, okay? The louder and more vicious they are, the higher their voltage. Now, amperage or current is if they climb over the fence and kick your ass, okay? And the amount of amperage is how bad of an ass kicking you get. Now, I know that's a crazy analogy, but think about it here. What do we want to drive the reverb tank? Do we want to stand at the side of the reverb tank and curse at it, or do we want to kick its ass? I think you see why 4 amps is going to be some serious stimulation for the reverb tank. And the voltage, why waste your time threatening when you plan on going ahead and enacting your threats, okay? So what we want here to drive a speaker or a reverb tank is not a lot of yelling, but good solid action. And that's why we want high current. And don't tell me you get crazy analogies like this anywhere else, okay? Because I know you don't. Okay, now we're ready for part 2, and that is, how does the reverb tank work? Well, what it does is it tries to imitate something that occurs whenever you go to a big auditorium and listen to some sort of a sound source. Now here we have our amp and our speaker, and it's just blasting away here, okay? Now notice that some of the sound waves are going to come straight to your ears. This is you with your neatly parted hair and your little sunglasses. Okay, it's going to come straight to your ears. That's going to be like the dry signal in our reverb. Now, a lot of the signal, though, is not going to go straight to your ears. It's going to come up here and bounce, and you see it can bounce sometimes quite a distance. Now, think about a pool table. If you were to shoot a one bank shot and time how long it took for that to happen, it might be, what, like 3 seconds, 2 seconds, you shoot, and it hits the, hopefully, the 9 ball, okay, into the pocket. Now look at this one. This is a 2 bank shot. It takes longer to reach, doesn't it? And look down here, this one is a very complex shot. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 bank shot. Now the sound waves that are coming from the speaker, even though they all left the speaker at the same time, are going to reach your ears at different times depending on what route they take to get there. Now our brain, safely nestled below the nicely parted hair here, is quite a instrument of analysis. And what it does is it listens to the delays of all of these after tones that come in, and it gives you an idea of several things. How hard or firm is the bouncing wall here? Does it have sound deadening material on it like in a recording studio, or is it a plaster wall? It gives you an idea, depending on how long the delay took, is how big the room is. So they could blindfold you, put you in a room and let you listen, and you could come up with a fairly accurate estimate of how big the room is. At least you'd know if you were in a broom closet versus St. Patrick's Cathedral, okay? There's no doubt about it. Your brain can analyze these aftertones and come up with a pretty good idea of the size and resonance of the structure that you're within. Now, since we don't have room in our amp chassis or cabinet for St. Patrick's Cathedral, we have to come up with the next best thing. Looks like Jack's still hooked on the nip. We got him a jar of that new boutique-style catnip, and he sure seems to like it. Thanks to all you Patreon and PayPal contributors. There's Jack trying to bury his catnip so he can save it for a rainy day. No, now he's unburied it. Pretty fickle, Jack. So since we really don't have the space to put a giant cathedral or coliseum in our amplifier cabinet, we resort to a device like this to give us some delays in the return of the analog signal. And this is an amplifier tank. Now there's a whole bunch of different types of these, both in length, the number of springs, the way that the input and output are insulated, the way they hang. Some of them mount flat on the floor, like you'll see in Fender amplifiers. Some of them are going to mount on the wall vertically on the front of the cabinet, as we will see in our 6G15, and some will hang this way. And we'll see that you cannot take this type of mounting tank and say, oh heck, I think I'll just mount it up here. They're made differently. So let's go into some detail on how the tanks are made, how they function, and learn all we can about them. Okay, we see here that we have nice soft rubber mounts for the tank. That is to isolate it from external interference. Here's a good example. We're feeding in a lovely, nice wet signal here from our reverb driver amplifier. And it's passing through our springs in ways that we'll discuss in just a minute, and then going on to our amp. Meanwhile, a sumo wrestler is practicing his flamenco dancing, okay, right nearby, and is jostling the springs and injecting vibration into the springs that really doesn't relate much to wipeout, okay? So we want to prevent that. Hence, and this is critical, when you mount these, be sure that you isolate them from external vibration. Secondly, here's the output over here, cunningly marked with a O, and here with an I is the input. Notice that there is like bakelite insulation between the shield and the signal and the chassis of the tank. Okay, we'll see why that's important in just a few minutes. Some of these are not insulated and some are. And I'll just put in your mind a little idea here. Think ground loops. Okay, we have to be very careful the way we ground the tank and the way we ground our signals to avoid ground loops. Remember, we're sending a very sensitive signal into this, and when it comes out, we don't want it to have a whole bunch of hum and noise. Now, exactly how reverb tanks function is best first presented in a diagram, and then I'll show you in a real reverb tank exactly what these parts look like. Okay, first off, we have a tubular extension here that's hollow on the inside. It can be either made of brass or of plastic, the idea being that it is non-magnetic. At the rear end of it, we're going to have a little loop and connect a small spring, and to that we'll have a ferromagnetic rod. In other words, it's steel or iron, something that is affected by a magnetic field. Then at the other end, the distal end of that little ferromagnetic rod, we're going to attach our big long reverb tank spring. Next, we're going to put a laminated magnetic core on either side of that little ferromagnetic rod. We're going to wrap a coil around one end of it and make it then into an alternating electromagnet. It will, depending on the polarity of the signal coming in, either attract or repel the little ferromagnetic rod and wiggle the spring. Now, it can work two ways. You can feed in a signal here and wiggle this end, but on the other end, if you don't feed a signal in, the little rod wiggling here inside the magnetic core will generate an output signal. I think most of you know that a motor, if you apply current to it, is a motor, but if you turn the armature, it becomes a generator. The same with this. Then if I put my signal from my amplifier, my reverb driver in here, I will wiggle the spring. On the other end, depending on how this is wiggling, I will generate an output signal. This unit is called a transducer because it converts electromagnetic signals into physical output, vibrating the springs, and it can turn the physical vibration of the springs into an electrical signal. If this sounds at all familiar, it's exactly the way guitar strings work with guitar pickups. You have magnets aimed at vibrating strings, and you're creating an electrical output based on the vibration of those strings and the relationship between them and the magnet. Okay, here is the little tubular cavity with the spring that is connected down here at this end coming forward. The little ferromagnetic rod is barely visible back in here in that tunnel. we can't even see the spring that is connected between this end and the rod. It's concealed. But we can see the big reverberation spring outside here. We also see these laminations that wrap around in a C shape here, wrap around the little ferromagnetic rod, and then when this coil receives an alternating current input and varies its polarity, plus minus, minus plus, it's going to move this spring back and forth within the magnetic field. We see also while we're looking in here that all this takes place on a isolated platform that is spring suspended within the outer metal housing. So we not only have the rubber insulation from external vibration, we also have an inner spring-loaded isolation mechanism to keep this unit, the transducer and springs, from being affected by external vibration sources like our old friend the sumo dancer. So you say that's all fine and dandy, but how the heck does this little tin can emulate a large auditorium? Well, let's think about it. Okay, first of all, recall that our dry signal bypassed this system altogether. If you remember on the schematic that the incoming signal from the guitar had two ways to go. One into our reverberation circuit, and the other was to bypass it completely. Okay, so that's our dry signal. It's gone already down the road and is going to be processed by the amplifier at the other end. The wet signal, however, is going to be injected into this spring by this input transducer, and it's going to be wiggled. Now let's think of our guitar signal as the old sine wave coming down here. Now how long do you think it's going to take it to pass through this spring? Surely a whole lot longer than it took for our dry signal to zip through the wire, right, and bypass all this nonsense. So here we come, have our first overtone signal coming down here, being received by this transducer and being converted from a physical sine wave into an electronic signal that it outputs to the rest of our reverb circuit. But not all of the signals will be dealt with that way. Some of them are going to hit at this end, bounce back, and then come back again. So we're going to get an even greater delayed signal. How about some of them that try to bounce back and get hit head on by the incoming signal, partially canceling it, partially reinforcing it? So I think you can see all sorts of mayhem is going to be going on in this spring, actually both of these springs, to generate the sort of auditory chaos that we get when we're in the auditorium receiving all sorts of reflected sound signals from the room we're in. So as you can see, this small device can very well mimic all of the acoustic interactions of a very large auditorium and output a signal that reflects it. Here's an example of the springs that are in there, the big springs, and almost invariably they find that if you don't have a continuous spring like we had in that smaller tank, but if you have springs with breaks in between where they are soldered together, that it works better. And I hope you can figure out why. Think about the return signal. Some of it's going to come to this point and be bounced back right away. Some of it will pass through and come all the way down here before it's bounced back. So that gives us greater variety in the delay of our return signals. Also, I think it should be obvious that the delay associated with a single short spring like this is going to be what? About half, which you'd associate with a double spring. So the longer the tank and the longer the springs, the longer delay you can achieve with your reverb tank. Well, I think that's enough blathering for one day. Let's knock off and go outside. It's a beautiful day. Take a look at a nice old 40 Ford truck and go for a ride. Okay, and I'll see you again in part 2. Okay, gang, here's the one I've been saving till last. 1940 Ford pickup truck. It looks black at first glance, but it is a black cherry metallic. I don't know if with the sun in the proper position you can pick up on that maroon color that looks black. Body is perfect from what I can tell, and no trace of body work or collision or rust. Really a real treasure, probably from out here in the Southwest where it rains about once every decade. The grill I had to detail. The bumpers came this way. The car really came mostly this way, other than a bunch of nagging little details, which is typical on these things. People get about almost all the way around to home base and then they fall asleep. This one I had to carry at the last 10 feet, but it turned out, I think, really sweet. I went with stock looking wheels. They're really rally wheels with the center caps and the beauty rings. So from an outside glance you might think, oh, this is just an old stock restored pickup. Well, as you'll see, such is not the case. I knocked myself out on the bed. It had an old sheet of plywood back here, believe it or not, with some aluminum strips glued to it. Just hideous. This is all oak with the original style strips. The windshield and all the glass have all a new rubber gasketing. Beautiful tailgate and rear bumper. It's dual exhaust, which should give you a hint that it's no longer a stock truck. Let's take a look under the hood and you'll see what I'm getting at. Here we have the hood, or bonnet as the British would say, open, and lo and behold, it's a 305 Chevy engine with a TH350 automatic. And for all of you who are going to whine and complain, oh my God, is Chevy and a Ford? Well, when you get your 44 pickup, feel free to put whatever engine you want in it, but this is the engine that's in this car, and it works great. This is a freeway cruiser. This isn't a hot rod or a drag racer. It'll go 85 miles an hour on the freeway all day long till the police stop you, and it is just almost a luxury car. No wind noise, dead quiet, with power steering and power brakes. And you really can't ask for much more than that. And looking at the bugs on the radiator, I think you know I'm not lying about driving on the freeway. I thought the interior turned out really slick. Okay, it's a sort of a basket weave light material, which has mixed blessings really. It looks great, nice and cool, but I usually put a pad down here when I sit down in my greasy old Levi's on the seat just to keep it looking white. The door panels were all custom made by yours truly, as well as the armrests. And the kick panels with a really nice stereo system. It's not a tube radio like a lot of you suggest, but it sure does work. A nice original dash. All the instruments work. We've got a tilt wheel out of a Chevrolet, probably an S10 truck with a nice banjo steering wheel. And I guess in conclusion, I would say, what, S10 differential, rack and pinion, front steering from a Ford. I know you'll be glad to hear that. So let's knock off the chatter and get in this beast and go for a little spin. I'm really proud of the bed. It was a miserable job, but all made from scratch, although I bought the runners. You have to, the steel runners. But the painting and finishing and everything and installing is a real nightmare. But I'm very pleased with how it turned out. I really think it helps the overall appearance. It may only be a 305, but it still sounds plenty healthy. Okay, it's a pretty hot day here, probably around 80 degrees, so let's open the windows, open our front flap for air conditioning, and use the column shifter, which I kind of like. Put it in gear, and as Eric Burden would say, let's get out of this place. Well, here we are, cruising down the thoroughfare, crossing the silvery Rio Grande into New Mexico, and on our way to the open roads. From the sublime to the ridiculous, a nice trash truck here pulled up right in front of us. Lucky us. It's like someone's conspiring against us. We finally get past the garbage truck and now an endless line of orange cones. Pedal, damn you, pedal. Adios. I don't get this pedaling uphill. I'm strictly a downhill bike rider myself. In fact, people have been telling me I've been going downhill almost all my life. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We're about to begin our descent into the Rio Grande River Valley. Make sure your seatbelts are buckled and that your seats are in the upright position. We appreciate you flying Air Jack. We know you have plenty of choices, and frankly, we're puzzled why you picked us. But sit back. We hope the landing is smooth. Airspeed is close to 60 miles an hour. We've got plenty of gas, so it looks like we're going to come to visit. Put some new sheets in the guest room, beer in the refrigerator, and answer the door when we knock, if you choose to. Well, that's about it for the 1940 Ford truck. I really appreciate you joining me on a tour and a little drive. I know some purists will say, oh, what a crime to destroy a really nice original truck. Well, it had been destroyed before I got it. Okay, the engine had already been changed. And also I'll say this, I fix these up and sell them to supplement my rather meager Social Security income, and this is what sells. Restored originals don't. So it's really a business decision, as well as the fact that this is fun to drive and originals really aren't. So thanks for joining me, and I hope to see you again in the next video.